Tonight, we're settling in with the story of Abraham Lincoln, the modest rail splitter who rose to become America's 16th president and helped stitch a fractured nation back together. From a log cabin in the Kentucky backcountry to the words spoken at Gettysburg, his is a tale of heartbreak, hard-won triumph, and a lifelong search for common ground. So before you get too settled in, as always, if this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling is your thing, feel free to hit like and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Sometimes these stories pull us in so completely, we forget the whole point is to help you relax. So go ahead, dim the lights, click on a fan for a little background hum, and let's get into tonight's story together. It started in the quiet hill country of Kentucky. On February 12, 1809, inside a single-room log cabin near the small settlement of Hodgenville, a baby was born into hardship. They named him Abraham Lincoln. One day, he would lead an entire nation, though that future would have seemed unimaginable as he drew his first breath on the cold dirt floor of a frontier home. The family had almost nothing. Candles alone were a rare treat. His father, Thomas Lincoln, moved from job to job as a carpenter and farmer, a hard, no-nonsense man who trusted his hands more than his words. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was soft-spoken, warm, and quietly religious, and it was from her that young Abraham picked up a habit of reflection that never left him. The family kept relocating in search of land and opportunity, first through Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into Indiana. The terrain was unforgiving, and life demanded everything they had. Clearing fields by hand, planting, fencing, scraping together enough to make it through each winter. Then, when Abraham was only 9, tragedy hit. His mother came down with milk sickness, a fatal illness passed on through the milk of cattle that had grazed on a poisonous weed. She died within days, and the family was gutted by the loss. For Abraham, it left a wound that never fully closed, a grief he carried silently, woven into the melancholy that would mark him for the rest of his life. Some brightness returned to the household when his father remarried, a kind-hearted widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She brought comfort, order, and, crucially, books into the home. She recognized something thoughtful in young Abe. Where Thomas wanted a son who could swing an axe all day, Sarah pushed him toward the written word, and he embraced it eagerly, again and again. This was a boy with no private tutors, no nice clothing, hardly any classroom time at all, but he had an insatiable appetite for learning. In a world that expected him to plow fields and vanish into obscurity, Abraham Lincoln was quietly beginning to grow. Not just taller, but deeper. It was a small, unassuming start. But even the mightiest oaks begin as tiny seeds, and Lincoln was only just getting started. Abraham Lincoln's boyhood unfolded in stillness, dense woods, long winters, the unhurried pace of frontier existence. But something was stirring beneath that quiet. While other boys were out swinging axes or chasing game, Abraham could often be found under a tree with a book open on his knees, mentally somewhere far from the wilderness around him. Real schooling barely existed in backwoods Indiana. All told, Lincoln probably had less than a year of formal instruction. That never held him back. He'd track down any book within reach, sometimes hiking for miles just to get his hands on a few pages. The Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and later the plays of Shakespeare all became his unofficial instructors. His stepmother took notice. Sarah later recalled that Abe absorbed every book he could find and could recite passages back nearly word for word. She saw in him something others overlooked, an almost reverent drive to understand the world, to puzzle through questions most boys his age never bothered asking. Still, it wasn't easy being a boy who preferred reading to roughhousing. His father, Thomas, never quite grasped Abraham's fascination with books. To Thomas, labor mattered, not daydreaming. So even while Abraham handled his chores, splitting rails, hauling water, looking after the animals, his mind kept wandering. He pictured faraway places, legendary figures, ideas of justice, honor, and liberty. The neighbors found him a bit odd. He was tall, gangly, unusually strong, and yet reserved, almost bashful. But when he did speak, his words carried more weight than his age suggested. People were puzzled by this lanky young man who could recite whole passages of verse one moment and out-wrestle the toughest man in the county the next. Underneath that calm exterior, though, was a restlessness he couldn't shake. Lincoln wasn't content with the life fate had handed him. The cabin had taught him how to endure, but the books taught him how to think. And, more importantly, how to imagine something better. He once put it this way: "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who'll get me a book I ain't read." It was in those candlelit pages that Lincoln first began building the mind and the character that would eventually carry a nation through its bleakest chapter. By his early 20s, Abraham Lincoln had grown into a strikingly tall man, standing 6'4". His clothing rarely fit properly, pant legs too short, sleeves too loose. His face was lean and sun-worn, his voice unhurried and deliberate. He looked like he'd been carved straight out of the timber he used to split. In 1831, he showed up in the small frontier outpost of New Salem, Illinois, with no money, no formal training, and no real plan. What he did have was something far more valuable. People simply liked him. He took a job clerking at the local store, and even though business wasn't brisk, Abe left an impression wherever he went. He earned a reputation for scrupulous honesty. If he shortchanged a customer by even a few cents, he'd walk miles to make it right. Borrow a tool or a book, and he'd return it, often in better shape than he'd found it. That honesty earned him the nickname Honest Abe. But integrity alone wasn't what won people over. It was his humor, too. He spun long, winding, hilarious yarns that made listeners forget their troubles and lean in closer. He had a natural feel for language and comic timing, turning even the simplest story into something people remembered. He wasn't refined. He wasn't formally educated. But in New Salem, Lincoln was quietly building something far more valuable: trust. People sought him out for advice, for a laugh, and, before long, for leadership. In 1832, he ran for a seat in the state legislature and lost, but he didn't fade away. 2 years later, he tried again and won. In the gap between those two runs, he served a short stint in the Black Hawk War, not as a soldier who saw combat, but as an elected captain, chosen by his fellow volunteers, which was itself a sign of the trust he'd earned. His time in New Salem didn't last long, but it laid the groundwork for everything that followed. It was there that he got his first real taste of public life. There, the quiet boy who once read by firelight became a man other people actually listened to. He wasn't merely telling stories anymore. He was starting to write one of his own. After leaving New Salem, Lincoln turned his ambitions toward the law. He had no degree, no classroom instruction, no formal mentor. Instead, he taught himself, borrowing law books and poring over them late into the night, the same way he'd once devoured poetry and scripture as a boy. By 1836, he'd passed the Illinois bar and become a licensed attorney. He settled in Springfield, a bustling, ambitious town buzzing with politics and opportunity. There, he joined a law practice and began handling every kind of case imaginable: property disputes, unpaid debts, assault charges, even murder trials. He quickly became known as a capable, honest and fair-minded lawyer, plain-spoken in court, willing to use humor when it helped, and never one to humiliate an opponent even after outmaneuvering them. But Springfield reshaped more than his career. It reshaped his heart, too. It was there he met Mary Todd, an educated woman from a well-off Kentucky family. She was unlike anyone he'd known before. Sharp-minded, self-assured, and just as passionate about politics as he was. Their courtship was anything but smooth, engaged, then apart, then reunited again. Some of his friends thought he doubted he was good enough for her. Others believed he worried he couldn't give her the life she deserved. Either way, on November 4th, 1842, they married. Their relationship was intense and sometimes turbulent. Mary had a quick temper and battled emotional struggles. Lincoln, calm on the surface but often withdrawn, wrestled with his own melancholy. They loved each other fiercely and endured plenty of hard seasons together. They had 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. Though sorrow visited the family more than once. Edward died at only 4 years old. Willie, said to be Lincoln's favorite, died of illness inside the White House at age 11. Only Robert lived to see adulthood. Behind the courtroom wins and his rising public profile, Lincoln carried a quiet, private grief. He often withdrew, spending long stretches alone. Those close to him described a sadness that never fully lifted, trailing him like a shadow, and yet he pressed on. He'd come to understand that the law was about more than rules and arguments. It was about people, about fairness, about right and wrong. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Lincoln had already begun imagining a country that could be fairer than the one he'd inherited. By the mid-1850s, America was straining under the weight of its own contradictions. It called itself the Land of Liberty while millions remained enslaved. The fight over slavery had stopped being just a political issue. It had become a question of national identity, and Abraham Lincoln, a former one-term congressman, found himself pulled back into the middle of it. At first, he hadn't spoken out with much force. He considered slavery morally wrong but didn't see himself as a firebrand. What he did believe, firmly and clearly, was that slavery must not be allowed to spread. That conviction is what drew him back into public life. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, letting new territories vote on whether to permit slavery. To Lincoln, this wasn't simply poor policy. It was a betrayal of the country's founding principles. He began speaking again, tentatively at first, then with growing force and clarity. Then came 1858 and the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas was an experienced, charismatic senator. Lincoln, his challenger, seemed plain by comparison. But across 7 open-air debates held throughout Illinois, Lincoln surprised everyone. He didn't shout or insult. He reasoned patiently and persistently. He asked whether a nation could survive half slave and half free, and made clear he didn't believe it could. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but his words spread far beyond Illinois. Newspapers across the country reprinted his arguments. People began talking about this tall, awkward lawyer from the Midwest who spoke with such honesty and moral clarity. By 1860, he was being floated for the nation's highest office. The Republican Party saw something rare in him, a man who opposed slavery without hatred, who spoke with firmness but not cruelty. He wasn't the front runner, but in a divided field, he emerged as the nominee. Then, on a cold night in November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. The South didn't wait for his inauguration. Within weeks, states began seceding. The Union itself, the very idea of the United States, was coming apart. Lincoln hadn't even reached the White House yet, and already he was stepping into history. When Lincoln took office in March 1861, he inherited a country already teetering on the edge. 7 southern states had seceded before he'd even taken the oath. More would soon follow, convinced his presidency threatened their way of life, above all, the institution of slavery. Lincoln didn't want war, he wanted unity. But once Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter that April, the decision was effectively made for him. The Civil War had begun. He had never led an army, never commanded troops, never studied military strategy. Yet the fate of the nation now rested on his shoulders. He read military texts at night, consulted his generals by day, and made painful decisions, often in solitude and often riddled with doubt. The war ground on, brutal and relentless. The casualty numbers climbed with every battle. Young men on both sides marched into muddy fields and never came home. Cities burned. Families were torn apart. Brothers turned against brothers. It had stopped being a political disagreement. It had become a human catastrophe. Lincoln faced criticism from every direction. Newspapers ridiculed him. Political rivals branded him a tyrant. Even his own cabinet members questioned his judgment. He cycled through general after general, desperate for someone equal to the moment. And at home, he grieved. In 1862, his cherished son Willie died of typhoid fever inside the White House. Lincoln, already prone to sorrow, was devastated. He shut himself away, at times visiting Willie's grave late at night. Even so, he kept going. In the midst of all this turmoil, he made one of the boldest moves in American history. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It didn't end slavery overnight, but it transformed the war's meaning, turning the conflict into a moral cause, not merely a fight to preserve the Union, but a fight to redefine it. Lincoln once said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." With that proclamation, he backed those words with the full authority of the presidency. He wasn't just trying to win a war, he was trying to win the soul of a country. As the fighting dragged on, Lincoln understood something profound. Battles might decide a war's outcome, but words could shape a nation's spirit. He had always chosen his language with great care, but in 1863, standing on ground still soaked with blood, he delivered a speech that would echo for generations. The Battle of Gettysburg had been among the deadliest of the entire war. More than 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The town bore the scars. Its fields turned into graveyards. That November, months after the fighting ended, Lincoln traveled there to help dedicate a national cemetery. He wasn't even the featured speaker. That honor belonged to a renowned orator who spoke for over 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose. He drew a folded sheet of paper from his coat and began to speak. His voice was soft, and the speech lasted barely 2 minutes, just 272 words. No theatrics, no dramatic flourishes, just clarity, purpose, and a kind of poetry. 77 years ago, he began, reaching back to the country's founding. He reminded everyone present, and the whole nation, that this war wasn't only about preserving the Union. It was about proving that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was a vow, a reminder, a challenge all at once. At first, the crowd was mostly silent, unsure what to make of something so brief. But over time, those words took on a life of their own. They were repeated in classrooms, carved into monuments, memorized by generation after generation. In a moment of chaos, Lincoln offered simplicity. In a moment of hatred, he offered dignity. He wasn't trying to crush his opponents. He was trying to lift up the living, to give meaning to the dead. The Gettysburg Address wasn't just a speech. It marked a turning point not in the war itself, but in the country's sense of identity. Lincoln reframed what it meant to be American. Not simply a matter of shared borders, but of shared ideals. He believed words had the power to heal, and with 272 of them, he helped a grieving nation begin to remember what it stood for. As 1865 began, the war's end was finally within reach. After 4 grueling, bloody years, Union forces were closing in on the Confederacy. Cities had fallen, supply lines were breaking down, and Southern resistance was steadily crumbling. But Lincoln didn't celebrate. He was exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually. The war had visibly aged him. His face had grown lined, his eyes weary, his once dark hair almost entirely gray. Friends and journalists remarked on how thin he'd become. The weight of war, loss, and division had carved itself into his frame. Yet his focus never wavered. Even with victory in sight, his thoughts turned not to punishment, but to healing. In his second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, Lincoln spoke not with triumph but with grace. There was no gloating, only words of reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he urged the nation to mend its wounds and care for those who had suffered, North and South alike. It stands as one of his most moving speeches. Calm, humble, deeply human. Then, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had held, and slavery, the institution that had torn the country apart for generations, was finally coming to an end. Bells rang across the North. Crowds gathered to celebrate. There was a sense of relief, of cautious optimism. People began imagining a future built around rebuilding and reunion. Lincoln started making plans, not just to restore the South, but to reimagine what the country could become. He never got that chance. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. As he sat in his box, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped in and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the following morning, April 15th, with his wife Mary at his side, and the nation plunged into mourning. He had lived to see the war's end, but not the peace that was meant to follow. When Lincoln died, the country lost more than a president. It lost its sense of direction. Word of his death swept across the nation like a cold wind. In the North, people wept in the streets. Church bells tolled for hours. Businesses shut their doors. Whole cities fell quiet. Even those who had once criticized him now spoke of his greatness with something close to awe. His body was carried by funeral train from Washington all the way back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. Along the route, thousands stood silently by the tracks as the train rolled past. Men removed their hats. Women pulled their children close. It wasn't just grief. It was a final farewell to the man who had held the country together through its darkest hour. Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, near the town where he'd once walked as a young lawyer. A towering monument would eventually mark the site, and later his likeness would be carved into Mount Rushmore and printed on American currency. But beneath all the marble and myth-making was simply a man. One who battled depression, who understood grief intimately, who never believed himself extraordinary, and yet he changed everything. Lincoln didn't live to witness the struggles of Reconstruction or the long civil rights movement that would unfold more than a century later. But the seeds he planted, in his speeches, his laws, his moral conviction, kept growing. He reminded the country what it should aim to be. Not flawless, but better. Not divided, but united. Guided not by hatred or fear, but by compassion, reason, and courage. Today we remember Lincoln as the great emancipator, the man who saved the Union, a leader who combined strength with gentleness. But what makes him truly remarkable may not be what he accomplished so much as who he was. A boy who read by candlelight, a lawyer who spoke plainly and honestly, a leader who never lost sight of what it meant to be human. His life is a reminder that greatness doesn't demand perfection, only purpose, integrity, and a heart unwilling to look away from what's right. And in that sense, Abraham Lincoln still lives on, in the ideals he helped shape and the quiet strength he left behind. For many people, the word Viking brings to mind wild warriors in horned helmets, torching villages and leaving destruction in their wake. But as is so often true with history, the reality is more complicated and far more compelling. The Vikings weren't one unified people or empire. They were Norse seafarers from what's now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, active from the late 8th century into the early 11th. They didn't even call themselves Vikings. The word functioned more like a verb than a name. Going Viking meant heading out on an expedition, sometimes to trade, sometimes to raid. In everyday life, they were farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, storytellers. They tended goats and grew wheat. They built timber halls. They worshipped gods like Odin and Thor, and believed fate itself was spun by unseen figures, the Norns, who watched over every human life. Most Viking men were never warriors at all. They were laborers, strong and skilled, deeply tied to the land they worked. But when the harvest failed, when the fjords froze over, when opportunity beckoned across open water, many picked up shields and swords. This wasn't bloodlust driving them. It was necessity and ambition. Their world was defined by punishing winters, brief summers, and a constant struggle against nature. Yet they were remarkably adaptable, endlessly curious. They sailed seas that others avoided out of fear. They explored uncharted lands and mingled with cultures well beyond their own. Some turned to trade, navigating the rivers of Eastern Europe to exchange goods like silk and spices with the Byzantines. Others founded settlements as far afield as Ireland, France, and even Russia. To the people they attacked, they looked like barbarians, bringers of ruin. But in their own eyes, they were daring pioneers, forging a future in a world that had given them very little. It's tempting to reduce them to a single image, raiders, and nothing more. But their real story is far richer and far more human. Before we follow them across the seas into battle and legend, it's worth remembering, the Vikings weren't monsters. They were people, and they were about to change the world. If the Vikings had one decisive edge, it was their ships. Long, sleek, and elegantly built, the Viking longship was more than a means of getting from place to place. It was a symbol of freedom, dread, and possibility all at once. Carved from oak and put together with remarkable precision, these vessels were both sturdy and surprisingly flexible. The planks overlapped like fish scales, held fast with iron rivets, and sealed with animal hair and tar to keep out the icy sea. This construction let the hull flex with the waves rather than fight against them, giving the ships extraordinary stability even in rough water. Each one was a feat of engineering. A typical longship could carry between 40 and 60 warriors, along with gear, tools, and supplies. But their real power wasn't size or speed. It was versatility. Viking ships could cross open ocean and then glide silently up narrow rivers. They could operate in water barely a meter deep, letting them strike far inland where nobody expected them. And they needed no harbor or dock, just a strip of beach, a shallow bank, or a rocky shoreline. By the time locals spotted them, the Vikings were often already on land. At the bow of many ships sat a carved figurehead, often a dragon or serpent, meant to unsettle both enemies and evil spirits alike. As these ships approached, the water seemed to churn beneath their prows, sails swollen with wind, crews quiet but ready. The sight of a longship on the horizon became something out of nightmares across Europe, a signal that trouble was on its way, sudden and merciless. But not every longship was built for war. Some were broader, deeper cargo vessels meant for trade. Others were purpose-built for exploration, sailing west toward Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The longship was more than a piece of machinery. It represented freedom, a way out of poverty, a path to glory, or a route to a new home. With these ships, the Vikings weren't confined by borders. The ocean was their highway, and every horizon was an open invitation. Europe first truly reckoned with the Vikings on an otherwise ordinary summer day in the year 793. It happened on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England. For years, monks had lived there peacefully, copying manuscripts, praying, tending their flocks, a place devoted to silence, learning, and faith. Then came the ships, long, narrow, unfamiliar, slicing through the water with unsettling grace. There was no warning, no negotiation, no chance to prepare. The Vikings landed swiftly. Axes flashed, shields clashed, and within moments the monastery, once a refuge, had become a scene of horror. The monks, unarmed and defenseless, had no walls, no soldiers, nothing to brace themselves with. Some were killed outright, others were taken as captives. The church was stripped of gold, silver, and sacred relics. This wasn't merely theft, it was a profound shock. Christian Europe believed its holy places were shielded by divine protection. Yet here were these strange men from the north, invoking gods of thunder instead of Christ. News of the attack spread rapidly, recorded with fear and disbelief. "The wrath of the heathen men rages," one chronicler wrote. To the English, the Vikings seemed almost demonic, merciless, savage, without faith. To the Vikings themselves, it was something else entirely. They saw wealth sitting unguarded, ripe for the taking, and they took it. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Over the following decades, Viking raids grew more frequent, striking not just England but Ireland, Scotland, and the coasts of France. They hit monasteries, ports, and villages, always fast, often before anyone could mount a defense. Destruction for its own sake wasn't the point. They came for silver, spices, livestock, and captives, driven by survival, ambition, and, at times, the desire to prove their courage. To a Viking raider, a successful raid meant honor, a portion of the spoils, and a reputation that would be sung about around firelit halls for years. But these early raids set something larger in motion. They reshaped how the wider world viewed the North, and they marked the start of an age in which no coastline felt safe again. Although history tends to remember Vikings mainly as brutal raiders, that's only one piece of a much bigger picture. Not long after the earliest waves of coastal raids, something unexpected began to happen. The Vikings didn't always leave. They stayed. They built. They became settlers. In Ireland, towns such as Dublin and Wexford began as small Viking outposts, simple camps where raiders could rest, repair ships, and gear up for the next expedition. Over time, though, these camps expanded. Markets sprang up, homes were built, families formed. Raiders had become residents. The same shift played out across northern England, where the Vikings carved out territory known as the Danelaw, a region governed under Norse law rather than English rule. In Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands became strongholds of Norse power. Even in what's now Russia, Vikings known as the Rus navigated the river systems and began governing Slavic towns, laying the groundwork for trade centers that would eventually grow into cities like Kiev. One especially significant shift happened in France. In 911, a Viking chieftain named Rollo struck a bargain with the Frankish king, Charles the Simple. Rollo had spent years raiding along the Seine River in northern France, but rather than continue the endless bloodshed, Charles offered him land in exchange for peace. Rollo took the deal, and the territory became known as Normandy, land of the Northmen. There, Norse culture gradually blended with Frankish tradition. The Vikings converted to Christianity, adopted local customs, language, and farming methods. Within a handful of generations, their descendants were fully French, though they still carried traces of their Viking heritage. This same pattern played out across the Viking world. The same hands that once swung axes turned to tilling soil. The same ships that once carried warriors now hauled grain, cloth, and tools. Swords gave way to plows. Viking settlers intermarried with local populations, picked up new languages, and either kept or set aside their old gods. They weren't only invaders, they were founders too. The image of the lawless, wild Viking obscures a deeper truth. They didn't just tear kingdoms down, they built them. To really understand the Vikings, you have to understand what they believed. Because behind every raid, every voyage, every last stand on the battlefield lay a belief in something larger than themselves, something eternal. The Norse universe was crowded with gods, giants, spirits, and fate. Vikings believed life wasn't random, but was literally woven by three mysterious figures known as the Norns, who sat at the roots of the great world tree, Yggdrasil, spinning out the destiny of every man and woman. At the center of it all stood Odin, the All-Father, a one-eyed god of wisdom, war, and poetry, who had traded one of his own eyes for greater knowledge. He was, in a way, always searching, much like the Vikings themselves. Then there was Thor, the thunder god, wielding his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, protecting gods and mortals alike from the forces of chaos, riding into battle amid lightning. Many Vikings wore small hammer amulets in his honor, symbols of strength and courage. Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and war, also held a central place in their beliefs. It was said she claimed half of all fallen warriors' souls for her own hall, while the other half went to Odin's great hall, Valhalla. Valhalla. To the Vikings, death wasn't something to dread. A man who died bravely in battle would be carried by Valkyries, Odin's warrior maidens, to the golden halls of Valhalla, where he would feast, fight, and celebrate until the end of time. But a warrior who died of illness, cowardice, or simple old age wouldn't reach Valhalla. He'd fade instead into a dimmer, lesser afterlife. To die without honor was considered the ultimate tragedy. This belief shaped how Vikings lived. They embraced risk. They faced battle with courage, not because they didn't fear death, but because they hoped to earn a place in the next world. Their myths weren't just stories. They were instructions, guides for living with pride, enduring hardship, and meeting death without flinching. To the Norse, the gods weren't distant. They were present, watching, waiting. And when a Viking raised his sword and charged into danger, he believed he wasn't facing it alone. It's one of the most recognizable images in popular culture. A towering, wild-haired Viking warrior with a snarling beard and a helmet crowned with massive curved horns. It looks fierce. It looks bold. It's also completely false. The idea that Vikings wore horned helmets is a myth, one that has nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with art and theater, created centuries after the Viking Age had ended. No horned Viking helmet has ever been unearthed. None appear in carvings, tapestries, or written accounts from the period. The helmets that have actually been found, like the well-known example discovered in Geirmundbu, Norway, are simple, practical, made of iron, rounded, reinforced, close-fitting, built for function, not spectacle. So where did the horned image originate? It emerged in the 1800s during the Romantic era, when artists and composers grew fascinated with ancient myths and warrior cultures. When Richard Wagner wrote his famous operas about Norse gods and heroes, costume designers wanted something visually dramatic to match the music. So they added horns. Those theatrical helmets looked striking on stage, giving performers a larger-than-life presence. Audiences loved it, and the image took hold. Books, paintings, and eventually Hollywood films embraced it. Horned helmets became shorthand for wild strength, a quick visual cue for Viking. But real Viking fighters would have found such headgear absurd. Horns on a battlefield would have made a warrior an easy target. They could snag on weapons, get caught in doorways, or throw off balance mid-fight. Vikings were practical people. Their equipment was built for survival, not showmanship. That doesn't mean they lacked artistry. Their weapons and armor were often intricately decorated with knotwork and animal motifs, their ships adorned with dragon-headed prows, their jewelry rich with symbolism. But in combat, efficiency came first. Even so, the myth persists in cartoons, costumes, even sports logos. It's a hard image to shake, even when the historical record tells a different story. But the truth is more interesting than the fiction, because real Vikings never needed horns to be terrifying. They had skill, they had strategy, and they carried a stillness before the storm that no helmet could ever capture. The Vikings weren't only raiders or settlers, they were explorers too, restless, curious, unafraid of the unknown. While much of Europe treated the sea as a boundary, the Norse treated it as a road. A challenge, yes, but never a wall. Driven by overcrowded homelands, scarce farmland, and the lure of riches, Viking explorers pushed past the known edges of the map. Their longships, fast, light, and remarkably maneuverable, let them go where nobody else dared. First, they sailed west to the British Isles, then farther still to the wild coastlines of Ireland and Scotland. Soon they came upon the windswept Faroe Islands, and then a vast newly found land, Iceland. In the late 9th century, Norse families began settling there, building farms, establishing a parliament, and writing sagas, tales of gods, ghosts, and heroic voyages. Even Iceland wasn't far enough. By the late 10th century, Eric the Red, a bold, exiled chieftain, set out from Iceland and reached an icy, sprawling coastline. He named it Greenland, hoping the name itself would draw settlers, and it worked. But the most legendary voyage of all came next. Around the year 1000, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, sailed even farther west and landed somewhere new, a place with forests, grasslands, and wild grapes. The Norse called it Vinland. Most historians believe Vinland corresponds to parts of what's now Newfoundland, Canada. Leif and his crew built a small settlement, now known as L'Anse-aux-Meadows, the earliest confirmed European presence in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus ever left Spain. But the Norse presence in Vinland didn't last. Conflict with indigenous peoples, brutal winters, and sheer distance from home eventually forced them to abandon it. Still, they had made the crossing, and made it back. Their voyages weren't only about conquest, they were about possibility. Vikings sailed the rivers of Eastern Europe, traded with the Byzantine Empire, and pushed through deserts and forests in search of something more. They didn't always know their destination, but they went anyway. In a world hemmed in by fear, the Norse spirit moved with the tide, always pressing outward, always wondering what lay beyond. No age lasts forever, not even one shaped by wind and sea. By the mid-11th century, the Viking world was shifting, slowly at first, then all at once. The raids that had once terrorized Europe's coastlines began to taper off. Longships still sailed, but they carried more cargo than warriors. Hands that had once gripped axes were now signing treaties, trading furs, kneeling in prayer. One by one, old pagan beliefs gave ground to Christianity. Missionaries had arrived decades before, some as captives, others as guests, and their influence steadily spread. Kings and chieftains began converting, not always for spiritual reasons, but also for alliances, legitimacy, and peace with Christian neighbors. Religion brought structure, and structure brought kingdoms. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, powerful central monarchies began to take shape. Local chieftains gave way to royal law. Raiding was replaced by taxation. The fierce independence that had once defined Viking society was steadily reshaped by order. At the same time, European defenses grew stronger. Castles rose along coastlines, towns fortified their walls, and the element of surprise that had once made Viking raids so effective began to vanish. The world was simply becoming harder for Vikings to operate in. One of the final chapters came in 1066. Harald Hardrada, a powerful Norse king, sailed to England hoping to reclaim a throne. He fought valiantly at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but was killed in the fighting. Just weeks later came a second invasion, this time led by William, Duke of Normandy, himself a descendant of Vikings. He conquered England not as a raider, but as a king. The Viking Age had come full circle, from sea-born raiders to crowned rulers, from spoken myth to written law. And then the sails faded from the horizon. But even as the raids ended, the legacy endured. In place, names, in languages, in bloodlines, in the fierce independence of Iceland, in rune-carved stones that still seem to whisper their stories. The Viking Age had passed, but its restless, curious spirit had already reshaped the world, and some part of it still moves quietly beneath the surface of history. The sails are gone, the oars long stilled. Longships now rest in museums and burial mounds. But the Viking legacy still ripples through the world today. They left behind no empire in the traditional sense, no sprawling ruins, no marble temples. And yet their influence is woven deep into the fabric of modern Europe and beyond. In England, more than 1,000 towns and villages carry Norse names. Words like knife, sky, window, and berserk trace straight back to Old Norse. Even the days of the week: Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Freya, are quiet reminders that Viking gods still echo through our calendars. In Ireland, cities like Dublin began as Norse settlements, first as staging grounds for raids, then as trading hubs, and eventually as thriving medieval towns. In France, the Normans, descendants of Viking settlers, went on to shape European history through conquest and governance, most famously in 1066, when William the Conqueror claimed the English throne. In Iceland, the language has survived almost unchanged, close enough to Old Norse that the ancient sagas can still be read aloud with little translation, preserving the myths, values, and dreams of a people from centuries ago. But the legacy isn't just historical, it's cultural, even emotional. The Viking spirit of daring, endurance, and curiosity has become a symbol recognized worldwide. Books, films, games, and television shows keep reimagining their stories, often blending myth with fact. Yet, something authentic still comes through. A sense of wild freedom, of meeting storms head-on, of crossing boundaries others feared to approach. We remember the Vikings not just for their fierceness, but for their humanity, people who lived fully in a world that demanded both strength and sacrifice. They were poets and explorers, raiders and rulers, parents and storytellers, seekers of something more. The Viking Age may have ended, but its waves still lap at the shores of our culture, a gentle reminder that the sea was never really the end of their story. It was only ever the beginning. Long before Spanish sails ever appeared on the horizon, a city stood that seemed to defy nature itself. Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, rose out of the waters of Lake Texcoco like something out of a dream. A place of stone and symmetry, built across islands and linked by grand causeways, unlike anything Europeans had ever imagined. According to legend, the Aztecs founded it in 1325 after following a prophecy that led them to an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. That vision appeared on a swampy lake bed, and there they built their empire, stone by stone, canal by canal. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan had grown into one of the largest cities on Earth, home to more than 200,000 people. Its avenues were broad and orderly, its canals crowded with canoes, its skyline gleaming with white buildings, vibrant markets, and towering temples. At the city's heart stood the Templo Mayor, a massive twin pyramid reaching toward the sky. One side dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, the other to Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Offerings, prayers, and at times blood were given to maintain balance between earth and sky. Life in the empire followed a strict order. Nobles, priests, warriors, merchants, and farmers each had defined roles. Children learned to read pictographs. Tribute poured in from surrounding regions: cacao, feathers, obsidian, jade, maize, and more. The empire thrived through a combination of war, trade, and religion, with one man at its very center: Moctezuma II, emperor, ruler, and the god's representative on earth. Wise, cautious, deeply spiritual, he lived surrounded by advisors and omens, presiding not merely over a city but over a vast, sophisticated civilization spanning central Mexico. But Aztec rule wasn't a peaceful one. Many neighboring peoples resented their dominance, their demands for tribute, and their practice of human sacrifice. Beneath the empire's wealth and ceremony, old grievances quietly simmered. And far across an ocean the Aztecs didn't even know existed, ships had already set sail, carrying foreign weapons, foreign beliefs, and an appetite for gold and glory. Tenochtitlan still stood tall and unshaken, but storm clouds were gathering. In 1519, a fleet of 11 ships landed on the shore of the Yucatan Peninsula. Off them stepped Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador with no royal title, no significant army, and no formal authorization to conquer an empire. What he lacked in official sanction, he made up for with ambition, cunning, and a dangerous kind of charm. Cortés brought with him a little over 500 soldiers, a handful of cannons, 16 horses, and an unwavering conviction that both God and fortune favored him. What awaited him in the New World turned out to be far larger than he'd anticipated. As the Spaniards pushed inland, they encountered fierce resistance, but also allies. Many indigenous groups resented Aztec domination. They'd paid tribute for years, watched their sons taken for sacrifice, and longed for freedom. Cortés recognized an opportunity. He fought when necessary, but negotiated far more often. And in those early days, he gained something more valuable than any weapon. Malinche, also known as La Malinche, a native woman gifted in language and insight. She became his translator, cultural guide, and eventually his closest confidant. Through her, Cortés could communicate with local peoples, exploit their fears, forge alliances, and navigate a world he otherwise couldn't have understood. As the Spaniards traveled further west, they heard stories of a great empire in the mountains, cities gleaming with gold, towering temples, and a king who ruled with divine authority. To the Spanish, these tales only sharpened their hunger. To the people they encountered along the way, Cortés promised an end to Aztec dominance. He burned his own ships to eliminate any thought of retreat and marched onward, his forces now swelled by thousands of indigenous allies. Step by step, he drew nearer to the empire's heart. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma received reports of these strange newcomers, pale-skinned, bearded, clad in metal, riding creatures no one there had ever seen. Some believed they might be gods. Others sensed something far darker. As Cortés wound his way up the mountain roads, flanked by allies and armed with fire, both the emperor and the conquistador braced for a meeting that would alter history. One ruled an empire. The other had come to end it. On November 8, 1519, the two men finally stood face to face. Hernán Cortés, armored and resolute, surrounded by foreign weapons and native allies. Moctezuma II, draped in feathers and gold, ruler of a city that shimmered like a jewel upon the lake. This wasn't just a meeting between two men, it was a collision between two worlds. As Cortés and his soldiers entered Tenochtitlan, they were astonished. The city stretched for miles, its white temples rising above turquoise canals and lively marketplaces, cleaner, larger, and more sophisticated than anything they'd seen back in Europe. Some of the Spaniards reportedly whispered that they'd stepped into a dream. Moctezuma greeted them not with weapons, but with ceremony. He offered gifts of gold, food, and fine cloaks, spoke words of peace, and housed Cortés in a royal palace. Spanish accounts suggest he may even have bowed, though exactly what that gesture meant to him and how the Spanish interpreted it remains uncertain. For Moctezuma, this was a delicate moment. The omens had been troubling. Lightning striking temples, strange visions in the sky, rumors of unfamiliar men arriving from the east. His priests feared the return of Quetzalcoatl, a god said to return from across the sea. Moctezuma was thoughtful but cautious. He may have believed diplomacy offered the only path away from bloodshed, or perhaps he simply wanted more information before acting. Whatever his reasoning, he chose to welcome Cortés as an honored guest, rather than treat him as an invader. To Cortés, though, that reception looked like weakness. He saw riches, not ritual. An empire ready to be taken, not a sovereign power extending hospitality. The two men could only communicate through layers of translation, from Nahuatl to Mayan to Spanish, and meaning slipped through the cracks with every step. Respect was read as submission. Ceremony was read as fear. The Spanish believed they'd gained the upper hand. The Aztecs believed they were simply preserving balance. In that fog of mutual misunderstanding, the seeds of disaster were quietly planted, and beneath the shadow of the great temples, the slow unraveling of a civilization had already begun. At first, the Spaniards were treated as honored guests in Tenochtitlan, housed in a grand palace, fed the empire's finest food, and allowed to move freely through the city. Cortés walked its avenues, studied its temples, observed its people. He was captivated but never naive. Behind the admiration lay calculation. He knew he was surrounded. His forces, though growing, remained badly outnumbered. The Aztecs were disciplined, well-organized, and militarily formidable. If Moctezuma gave the word, the Spaniards could have been wiped out in a single night. So Cortés struck first, not with violence, but with strategy. He placed Moctezuma under house arrest. It wasn't a dramatic seizure. The emperor stayed in his palace, still dressed in gold, still treated with apparent honor. But now guards stood at every door. The man who had once ruled an empire could no longer move freely through his own city. To the Spanish, this looked like a masterstroke. Control Moctezuma, and you control the empire. For a while, that illusion seemed to hold. The emperor remained passive, perhaps resigned, perhaps still hoping to avoid all-out war, perhaps still believing the Spaniards could eventually be persuaded to leave, or perhaps he had simply begun losing faith, not just in diplomacy, but in the gods themselves. While confined, Moctezuma kept speaking to his people from the palace rooftop, assuring them the Spaniards meant no harm. He pleaded for calm, but calm was already crumbling. The Aztecs grew restless. Whispers turned to anger. Streets once filled with commerce and music now buzzed with tension. Many no longer saw Moctezuma as a true leader. He had let foreign invaders into their sacred city, had not resisted, had bowed too far. Cortés, too, sensed the shift. His arrangement with the emperor rested on shaky ground, and beneath him, the foundation of Aztec authority was beginning to fracture. Still, no blood had yet been spilled inside the city itself. A slim, fragile chance remained to avoid catastrophe. But the line between diplomacy and domination had already blurred, and soon a single act of violence would erase it for good. While Cortés was away from Tenochtitlan, having traveled to the coast to deal with a rival Spanish force sent to arrest him, he left his deputy, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge of the city. Alvarado was nothing like Cortés. Where Cortés relied on diplomacy and restraint, Alvarado governed through suspicion and fear. During Cortés's absence, the Aztecs prepared to observe one of their most sacred festivals, Toxcatl, a ritual honoring Tezcatlipoca, lord of night and fate. It was meant to be a time of music, dance, and ceremony held in the courtyard of the Templo Mayor. Nobles, priests, and warriors gathered in full ceremonial dress, adorned in feathers and gold. But to Alvarado, it looked like the beginnings of rebellion. He claimed to have heard rumors of an uprising, even though no attack had actually occurred. Paranoia clouded his judgment, and convinced the Aztecs were about to strike, he moved first. As dancers performed and drums echoed through the courtyard, Spanish soldiers stormed in, sealed off the exits, and without warning began killing. They cut down unarmed nobles and priests alike, slashing through the crowd with swords and spears. The blood of the city's most honored citizens soaked the temple stones. Those who tried to flee were cut down. Those who resisted were slaughtered. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The music stopped. The city fell into stunned silence, and that silence quickly turned to fury. When Cortés returned days later, he found a completely different city. The people, once cautious, were now enraged. The illusion of peace had shattered. Aztec warriors surrounded the Spanish quarters, sealing off the causeways, cutting off supplies. Tenochtitlan had become a trap, a boiling cage of stone and lake water. Inside, Moctezuma, still a prisoner, could no longer soothe his people. Many had stopped listening to him entirely. Some no longer even recognized him as their ruler. The empire had entered a state without balance or direction, and rage had rushed in to fill the void. Cortés tried to salvage the situation. He spoke with Moctezuma, offered gifts, pleaded for calm, but what had been spilled at the temple couldn't simply be swept away. The gods had been insulted, the ancestors dishonored. Sacred blood had been shed, and it would demand an answer. Trapped in a city that had once welcomed them, the Spaniards now lived behind makeshift barricades, their food dwindling, their allies dying, their hopes narrowing to a single goal: escape. Cortés tried diplomacy one final time, bringing Moctezuma up to the palace rooftop in hopes he could calm the crowds below. But the people no longer listened. Some hurled stones, and one struck Moctezuma in the head. He died days later under Spanish guard, in silence. His death marked the final break. The last symbol of peace had fallen. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortés made his move. Under a moonless sky and pouring rain, the Spaniards and their native allies began slipping out of the city, carrying as much as they could: weapons, supplies, and gold. Too much gold, which slowed them down and weighed them under. The narrow causeways over the lake turned into deadly bottlenecks. The Aztecs were waiting. Warriors attacked from canoes and rooftops. Arrows rained down. Spears cut through the darkness. Some Spaniards slipped on the wet stones and fell into the lake, dragged under by the weight of their own plunder. Others were captured alive, meeting their fate atop the very pyramids they'd once marveled at. Cortés fought to hold his forces together, but chaos took over. Bodies filled the water. Screams tore through the rain. In the darkness, no one could tell who had lived and who hadn't. By dawn, the survivors reached the far shore, bloodied, broken, hollow-eyed. Cortés reportedly sat beneath a tree and wept. This night became known as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Hundreds of Spaniards were dead, along with thousands of their native allies. The dream of conquest seemed to be shattered, but it wasn't over. Cortés regrouped. The survivors made their way to Tlaxcala, where they rested and rebuilt their strength. More allies joined him, united by a shared hatred of Aztec rule. Battered as they were, the Spanish still had their firearms, their steel, and their grim determination. But something else had already entered Tenochtitlan. Invisible, silent, and ultimately far more devastating than any weapon. Smallpox had arrived, and it would finish what warfare alone could not. Even as the Spanish licked their wounds and rebuilt their strength, an invisible enemy was already at work inside the Aztec capital. Smallpox arrived quietly, carried on the breath of a single infected man, an enslaved African who had traveled with the Spanish forces. At first, no one paid it much attention. A cough, a fever, a rash. Then it began to spread. Tenochtitlan, once alive with color, sound, and movement, began falling silent. Entire families were wiped out within days. Children, priests, and warriors alike were struck down without warning. The dead filled homes and temples. The living, too weak to bury them, began losing hope. The Aztecs had never encountered anything like this disease. Their healers were powerless against it. Their gods offered no relief. panic set in, followed by despair. As much as half the city's population may have died, not from battle, but from illness. Among the dead was Quitlawak, Moctezuma's brother and successor, whose reign lasted a mere 80 days. Leaderless and reeling, the empire chose a new ruler, Cuauhtémoc, a young noble burning with defiance. Meanwhile, Cortés returned stronger than ever, now commanding more than 100,000 native allies. Including the fierce Tlaxcalans, many tribes had suffered under Aztec rule for years and now saw a chance to break free, even if it meant fighting alongside the Spanish. In May 1521, Cortés launched the siege of Tenochtitlan. He first cut off the causeways, then blockaded the lake with brigantine ships he had built, severing the city from its food and supplies. Street by street, day by day, the Spanish and their allies fought their way through the capital. The Aztecs resisted fiercely, even as they starved and sickened, fighting from rooftops, canals, and the last sacred corners of their city, turning temples into fortresses and maize fields into battlegrounds. But they couldn't halt the siege. What the sword had started, disease had deepened, and hunger would soon finish the job. By the time the final assault began, Tenochtitlan was no longer the gleaming city Cortés had first laid eyes on. It was a shattered shell of itself, burning, broken, but still refusing to kneel. Not yet. By August 1521, Tenochtitlan, once a symbol of order, beauty, and divine purpose, had become a graveyard. The canals that once sparkled with sunlight and commerce now ran dark with filth and blood. The causeways were choked with bodies. The floating gardens withered in silence. Smoke rose from temples that had stood for centuries. For 93 days, the Aztecs held out, hungry, sick, and surrounded, fighting with sharpened stone, obsidian blades, and sheer determination. Their emperor, Cuauhtémoc, refused to surrender even as his people collapsed from exhaustion around him, believing to the end in the sacred nature of their cause. But the siege didn't relent. Spanish cannons tore through stone walls, the brigantines dominated the lake, and thousands of native allies overwhelmed the defenders. No help came, no miracle arrived, and finally, on August 13, 1521, the fighting stopped. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to flee by canoe. Brought before Cortés, he reportedly spoke with quiet dignity. "I have done what was my duty in defense of my people. Now I am your prisoner. Take this dagger and kill me." Cortés chose to spare him, perhaps recognizing value in keeping a living symbol of conquest. But the city itself was lost. Tenochtitlan, once home to over 200,000 people, had been reduced to rubble and ash. Its temples were looted, its sacred records destroyed, its survivors enslaved or left to starve among the ruins. The lake that had once sustained the city was drained and buried beneath the weight of a new empire. In its place, Cortés began building Mexico City, a new capital rising atop the bones of a fallen civilization. But something had died in the Spaniards too. The wonder they'd first felt on entering the city had given way to silence, to scorched stone, to echoes of what had once been. The conquest was complete, the victory total, and yet the cost, for conqueror and conquered alike, was beyond measure. The Aztec Empire, with all its gods, beauty, and contradictions, was gone. But the story, the memory, the weight of it, would endure. The Aztec Empire is gone. Its temples lie in ruins beneath asphalt and stone, its kings silenced, its gods no longer honored by firelight. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, surviving only in the accounts of chroniclers and the ruins buried beneath Mexico City. And yet something remains. You can hear it in the language. Nahuatl, the tongue of the Aztecs, is still spoken by more than 1 million people in Mexico today. Its words woven into everyday speech. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote. Sounds that once echoed through the halls of emperors now pass between farmers and their children. You can feel it in the art. intricate patterns, serpent motifs, eagle feathers carved in stone, echoes of a culture that saw the divine in every mountain, river, and sky, still inspiring galleries and markets today. You can taste it in the food. Maize, chili, cacao, once sacred staples that sustained an empire and now feed the world. And you can see it in the people. Descendants of the Mexica and other Nahua peoples still walk the streets of Mexico today, their heritage woven quietly into their faces, their crafts, their stories. Though the Spaniards built over the ruins, they could never erase the soul of what had come before. The conquest was swift, brutal, devastating. But it wasn't the end of the Aztec spirit. It was a forced, painful transformation, never a total one. Indigenous traditions adapted, survived in secret, and blended with the new to create something entirely their own. The fall of the Aztec Empire is often remembered as a cautionary tale, a clash of civilizations, a collision of ambition and misunderstanding. But it's also a story of resilience. For all the gold taken and all the blood spilled, the Spaniards could never take the memory. They couldn't silence the volcanoes that once watched over Tenochtitlan. They couldn't erase the stories carried in murals, chants, and whispered prayers to the old gods. And in the shadows of Mexico's cathedrals and government buildings, stones from ancient temples still lie quiet, watching. Time may have buried the empire, but its heart still beats beneath the soil, within the people, and in the stories we continue to tell. For the soldiers of the First World War, the trenches weren't just a battlefield, they were a way of life. Dug deep into the European landscape, stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, they formed a sprawling, zigzagging network of mud, blood, and wire. When men first arrived, many assumed it would be brief. A few weeks, maybe a couple of months. They had no idea it would stretch into years of mud-soaked silence, frozen fingers gripping rifles, sleeping mere inches from death. The trenches themselves were narrow, often barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. The ground, churned relentlessly by boots and rain, turned into a thick soup of water and rot. Wooden duckboards were laid down, but they simply floated atop the filth instead of solving it. In some stretches, soldiers stood ankle-deep in water for days, their skin softening, blistering, turning gray. This is where trench foot took hold, a condition that left feet numb, swollen, and eventually blackened. In severe cases, amputation was the only option. Above them, coils of barbed wire snarled in every direction, an endless tangle meant to slow the enemy and snare the careless. Just past it lay no man's land, the dead zone between opposing trenches, littered with shell craters, splintered trees, and bodies no one dared retrieve. Even in the quiet moments, death was never far off. Snipers watched for the slightest movement above the parapet. Artillery could strike without warning, turning calm into chaos in seconds. The air reeked of decay, unwashed bodies, and wet soil. Rats thrived, growing fat off the fallen. Lice burrowed into clothing and skin, causing relentless itching and spreading disease. Sleep came in short, broken bursts. Food arrived cold. A letter from home was treasured like gold, and yet the men adapted, digging deeper, building shelters from sandbags and scrap metal, sharing cigarettes, fashioning makeshift furniture from broken crates. They joked, wrote letters, and waited, day after day. In the trenches, survival wasn't only physical, it was mental, a matter of holding on to identity, humor, and hope. In the end, it wasn't always the front lines that broke men. More often, it was the slow, grinding monotony of life behind the mud and wire. Amid the mud and constant fear that defined trench life, one thing brought more warmth than any fire could: letters. Mail call was practically sacred. A scrap of paper from home, from a wife, a sweetheart, a mother, a child. meant more than food or rest. It was proof that life beyond the wire still existed, that somewhere, someone remembered you not as a soldier, but as a person. Soldiers wrote by candlelight, hunched in dugouts, thick with the smell of damp earth and tobacco. Their words were often simple, sometimes surprisingly poetic, always fragile. They described the weather, the food, small moments of calm. Many left out the horrors. They didn't want to burden the people back home, wanting to protect them even as shells exploded overhead. Some wrote every day, others less often, addressing wives as "my dearest," mothers as "dear mom," children with aching tenderness. "I hope you are well. I am still in one piece. I miss your voice. Tell the baby I love her." Some tucked in pressed flowers, hand-drawn sketches, or small trinkets found along the battlefield. Receiving a letter was practically a ritual. Soldiers would read it once, then again, folding it carefully, tucking it into a shirt pocket near the heart, or hiding it in a tin to keep it dry. They'd read them aloud to one another, pass them around, share in each other's joy or heartbreak. But sometimes a letter arrived too late, for weeks, and reaching camp only after its intended reader had already fallen. In those moments, fellow soldiers would gather around, open it carefully, and read the words aloud in memory of the man who'd never get to. One last connection to the life he'd left behind. In a war defined by machinery and chaos, where men were reduced to numbers and losses tallied by the thousands, letters were a reminder of everyone's humanity, bridges between two worlds, one of peace and one of war, carrying love, fear, longing, and hope. In a place where nothing felt certain, even a small letter could hold a man's spirit together. It was Christmas Eve, 1914, the first winter of a war many had assumed would already be over. The trenches were bitterly cold, coated in frost. Soldiers huddled beneath thin blankets, thinking of home, of warmth, of peace. Then, drifting across no man's land, came an unfamiliar sound. Singing. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. German voices rose gently into the night air. British soldiers listened, confused at first, then answered with carols of their own. Slowly, heads began rising above the parapets. What followed became one of the most profoundly human moments of an otherwise inhuman war. Without orders, without any plan, soldiers began climbing out of their trenches. They met in the middle of no man's land, that same stretch of dead ground littered with wire and bodies, and shook hands. They traded buttons, tobacco, chocolate. Some offered sausages or plum pudding. Someone produced a football, and a match broke out. Boots kicking through mud and snow, rifles left far behind. There was no score, no set teams, just men laughing together under a cold winter sky. They showed each other photographs of wives and children. They buried their dead together. They lit candles and shared songs in languages neither side spoke. For one brief moment, there was no war, no enemy, only men, cold and tired, longing for peace. It couldn't last. When commanders learned what had happened, they were furious. Strict orders soon forbade any further contact. Artillery fire resumed. Snipers returned to their posts. The soldiers went back to their trenches, back to the grim business of fighting men they had just shaken hands with. That kind of truce was never repeated on the same scale again. But for those who lived through it, the memory never faded. A brief flicker of light in a war built on darkness. Proof, if only for a day, that humanity could rise above even the worst of circumstances. It didn't end the war, but it showed that peace didn't always require a signature from generals. Sometimes it just needed to be chosen. By men with frozen hands and open hearts, the noise of war is impossible to forget. The shriek of shells, the relentless hammer of machine gun fire, the sudden final crack of a sniper's bullet. But what many soldiers remembered most vividly, years later, was the silence. Between battles stretched long hours where nothing seemed to happen at all. No advances, no charges, just the heavy, damp air of waiting. And it was in that stillness that the war took its deepest toll. During those quiet stretches, men sat alone with their thoughts. Some wrote letters. Some smoked until their hands trembled. Others simply stared at the wooden trench walls, eyes hollow, bracing for the next order, the next explosion, the next name lost. That silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, unnatural, the kind of quiet that made even birds nervous. Any sound at all, a snapped twig, a distant cough, could be a warning, a signal, a fatal mistake. Nighttime only sharpened the tension. Flares rose like pale ghosts above no man's land, casting long, warped shadows across the wire. Men spoke in whispers, wary even of their own voices, each hour bringing the same unspoken question. Is tonight the night they come? Sometimes the silence would shatter without warning. A shell dropping at random, a scout spotted in the wire, a raid, sudden and vicious, over almost as fast as it began. Then quiet would return, somehow heavier than before. During these lulls, soldiers repaired the trenches, buried the fallen, reinforced the walls, brewed tea in dented tins, played cards with worn-out decks, and told stories, some true, some invented, just to keep their minds anchored to something outside the mud. The silence offered no real rest, only reflection, and in that reflection, fear took root. Men began counting their own breaths, their days, their odds, listening to their heartbeat as though it were the last thing they truly owned. And still, they stayed, not for glory or ambition, but because the trench had become the only world left to them. Between the barrages, time seemed to slow. The war paused, but it never truly stopped. And in those long, hollow hours between thunder and death, the human spirit learned patience. Not the peaceful kind, but a quiet, stubborn endurance. In trench life, survival wasn't only about combat. It was about the waiting. The first gas attack arrived as a strange, low-lying green mist, drifting silently across the battlefield, hugging the ground as though it were alive. There was no explosion, no roar of warning, just an unnatural creeping fog. Then the coughing started. It was April 1915, near Ypres, Belgium, when German forces released chlorine gas against Allied lines. Soldiers stood frozen, watching the cloud roll toward them, not yet understanding what it was. And by the time they did, it was too late. The gas seared eyes and throats, turned lungs to liquid, and dropped even the strongest men to their knees, gasping like fish out of water. Panic spread faster than the gas itself. Men soaked rags in urine and pressed them to their faces, grasping at anything that might offer relief. Later came phosgene, deadlier and harder to detect, and then mustard gas, which blistered skin, blinded eyes, and lingered in the soil for weeks. It didn't just kill, it maimed and scarred, leaving men alive but permanently changed. Gas masks were soon issued, strange rubber contraptions with bulging, bug-like goggles and long snouts. They worked, but not always in time, fumbling to put one on in the dark. In the rain, in a panic, wasn't always possible. And the fear of gas never really went away. Even without an actual attack, soldiers imagined one. A whiff of smoke, a shift in the wind, an odd smell, and masks would be on within seconds. Many described gas as ghost-like, invisible, unpredictable, always somehow present, creeping into dreams and the deepest corners of the mind. Gas fundamentally changed the character of the war. It turned the very air into an enemy, transforming the trenches from a battlefield into a slow, suffocating tomb. Worse still, it stripped death of any personal meaning. No duel, no charge, no act of heroism. Just a single breath, and then agony. Even survivors coughed for years afterward, their lungs permanently damaged, their voices never quite the same. Of all the horrors of trench warfare, gas left one of the deepest scars, because it reminded soldiers that in this war, there was nowhere left to hide, not even in the very air they breathed, amid the mud, the barbed wire, and the constant threat of death. One thing made trench life survivable at all: each other. Comradeship wasn't just friendship, it was survival itself. When everything else was stripped away, the uniforms, the orders, the medals, what remained were simply men, cold and afraid, holding on to the familiar sound of a voice nearby. They came from every walk of life: farmers, factory workers, teachers, sons. Many had never traveled beyond their hometowns before the war. But in the trenches, those old distinctions faded fast. One man's dry socks became another man's lifeline. One soldier's sense of humor could keep an entire unit sane. They shared everything: cigarettes, blankets, rations, even lice, and passed along trench wisdom. Which dugout stayed driest? Which officer could be trusted? How to brew the best cup of tea over a candle flame? And when the shelling finally paused, even briefly, they gathered, mugs in hand, steam rising off weak, gritty coffee or tea brewed from boiled rainwater. These moments felt sacred. Men traded jokes, some crude, some clever, some so worn they'd been passed between units like heirlooms. They sang songs that reminded them of home, played cards, or simply sat in grateful silence, savoring the warmth and the company. They talked about life beyond the war: sweethearts, sisters, favorite meals, long summer days now far behind them. Some made plans for afterward: where they'd go, what they'd build, who they'd marry. Others said nothing at all, content just to listen, letting their friends' voices carry them somewhere safer, if only for a few minutes. And when one of them fell, it was never just a name on a casualty list. It was someone they'd laughed with, argued with, shared a blanket with, a missing seat in the circle, a silence louder than any gunfire. In a war marked by unimaginable loss, it was these small human connections that held men together. It wasn't glory or nationalism or orders that kept them going in the trenches. It was the bond between brothers, forged not in fire, but in frost, laughter, and the simple comfort of a hot drink passed from hand to hand. Nighttime in the trenches carried a different kind of dread. Darkness didn't bring rest. It brought uncertainty, blurring the line between what was real and what was imagined. Shadows stretched across no man's land. The sky that once held birds and clouds now held only silence, broken occasionally by a flare, burning bright and unnatural against the cold. Every sound mattered: a distant footstep, the scrape of a shovel, the sharp click of a rifle bolt. Any of it could signal an enemy patrol, a raid, or worse, an ambush. Men took turns standing sentry, motionless, straining their eyes into the dark, hearts pounding. A single mistake could mean a bayonet in the chest, or a death that came in whispers through the mud. On some nights, snipers waited patiently, scopes trained on even the faintest flicker of movement. A single glowing cigarette could be a man's final error. Sleep, when it came at all, was short and restless. Soldiers dozed with their boots still on, rifles close by, often crammed into dugouts barely wide enough to roll over in. Dreams, when they arrived, were filled with thunder and smoke. Many learned simply not to dream. The cold seeped into their bones. Blankets stayed damp, bodies pressed together for warmth, and still the fear lingered. Not every night ended in death, though. Some were eerily still, and that quiet could be just as dangerous. It was during these lulls that the mind began playing tricks. Was that movement beyond the wire? Was that footsteps, or just the wind? Whispers moved through the trenches like secrets. Orders were passed silently. Small patrols, 3 or 4 men at a time, slipped into no man's land like ghosts, gathering intelligence, laying wire, or simply reminding the enemy they weren't alone. Letters were written by flickering candlelight. Some love notes, others quiet goodbyes, rarely labeled as such, but written with the unspoken understanding that they might be the last. Night asked the questions daylight was too busy to consider. Will I survive? Will anyone remember me? And yet, when the sun finally rose again, casting weak light over the wreckage of wire and churned earth, the men were still there, tired, cold, but alive. In the trenches, every sunrise counted as a small victory. Not every wound suffered in the trenches came from bullets or shrapnel. Some injuries were quieter, invisible, but just as deep. Life in the trenches wore men down, not only physically, but spiritually. Every day chipped away at something: strength, clarity, hope. For many, the heaviest cost of the war wasn't death itself. It was surviving it. Trench foot, caused by days spent standing in cold, wet boots, turned skin pale and soft, then black, then dead. Some men lost toes, others whole feet. Lice burrowed into uniforms, spreading disease and relentless itching. Rats gnawed at food, equipment, even the fallen. But it was the unseen wounds that lingered longest. Shell shock, what today we recognize as PTSD, left men broken in ways the military of the time neither understood nor, in many cases, was willing to acknowledge. Some came home unable to speak. Others flinched at loud noises for the rest of their lives. Many were haunted by nightmares that never faded. At the time, some commanders dismissed it as cowardice, a failure of character. In reality, it was something far more tragic. These men weren't weak. They were overwhelmed, their minds worn down by relentless stress, constant noise, and horrors most people can hardly imagine. Then there were the dead who couldn't even be recovered, bodies left in no man's land, too dangerous to retrieve, too sacred to forget, standing as silent reminders of the cost behind every advance and every retreat. The emotional toll was staggering. Some soldiers carried guilt simply for surviving when their closest friends hadn't. Others went numb, burying their emotions beneath layers of mud and grief. Even time away from the front offered little relief. Soldiers on leave often struggled to adjust to quiet towns and warm homes. They couldn't talk about what they'd witnessed. They didn't know how. And those who hadn't lived through it simply couldn't understand. War changed these men. Not just their appearance or the way they carried themselves, but the way they felt, loved, and lived. The guns eventually fell silent, but the damage they left behind ran deep and wide. The trenches didn't just consume bodies. They consumed memories, voices, joy. And the echoes of that loss carried on for years, long after the fighting ended. The guns finally went quiet on November 11, 1918. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war meant to end all wars officially came to a close. But silence didn't equal peace. Across the Western Front, soldiers climbed out of the trenches slowly, cautiously, hardly able to believe the noise had truly stopped. Some wept. Others simply stood in stunned quiet. A few stared out across no man's land, wondering if the men who had fired on them just days before now felt the same strange emptiness. The war had ended, but the trenches remained. They didn't disappear. They sat in the mud, abandoned, gradually sinking back into the earth that had been torn apart for 4 brutal years. Boots, helmets, rusted rifles, and unsent letters were left behind. Small fragments of lives that had once filled those narrow passages. And the soldiers, they went home, but they didn't come back the same. Many struggled to find their footing in a world that had moved on without them.